I'll introduce myself first. I'm Deacon Mel Tardy. I am in South Bend, Indiana, about 90 miles southeast of you, and where University of Notre Dame is, which is where I work. I've been to St. Benedict's a few times. Some of you may recognize me from that. I also am involved with the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus as the president of the Clergy Caucus, and also a member of the National Association of Black Catholic Deacons. And I'm a permanent deacon. I've been a deacon since 2011, so this is my 9th year, going into my 10th year, I guess. And so what I've been asked to talk about is about vocations. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is why is it important to have an Indigenous Black Catholic clergy? I've already done our opening prayer here, but I wanted to focus just a little bit on this idea of holiness. We are all called to be holy as our Heavenly Father, our Heavenly God is holy. And so we have, this is our vocation. This is something that we are called to do. Everyone, by virtue of their baptism, is called to holiness. And what it means to be holy is to have our will be in sync with the will of God in heaven. That what God has sort of called us to be, we accept that call. There are different types of vocations that people may have, but sometimes we don't always realize that everyone is called to a vocation. So for those who can't see the image on the screen, what I have is an image of myself serving as deacon at my parish, St. Augustine's Parish in South Bend, and I'm administering the chalice for communion for folks who are going through their first communion. So different types of vocations. When we hear vocation, we think maybe like vocation to priesthood or vocation to different things. But let me reel it back for a second. So sometimes we think about vocation in terms of occupation. Like this is something that, someone might feel called to be a professional, let's say to be a doctor. Somebody might be called to be a doctor. Somebody might feel that they're called to be, my brother, he's called to be a professional musician. He plays the saxophone, plays jazz. Some people may feel called to be a teacher or something along those lines. And there, it's a calling where you determine what it is you want to do. You decide, okay? So whether you decide to do that or you do something else, it's fine. But the vocation that I'm talking about, where we're called to be holy, that God is calling us to do something. So in this sense, what we want to do is discover what is God calling each of us to do. And so it depends kind of on our what kind of state in life we think we're called to be. Some people are called to be single, and they will live their lives knowing that I am not called to be married. I'm called to live a single life, but I am called by God to do something with the gifts that God has given me. All right. Some people, they feel called to be married. I felt called to be married. I actually have my wife sitting next to me, but she's not in camera range at the moment, and maybe she'll get on later on. But as a permanent deacon, I'm actually a married deacon, and most permanent deacons are. But then some people are called to a religious life or consecrated life. And if you think about our brothers, our monks and friars, our sisters and nuns, they're called to religious life, to be part of a religious order, to be part of to take on maybe some vows or to live their lives in a special way to serve God. And then there are those who are called to be clergy, to be either deacons or to be priests. And then some of those priests may wind up becoming bishops or something else. And so that's the vocation that we need to discern, is that, am I called to single life? Am I called to a religious or consecrated life? Am I called to be married? Am I called to be, a priest? And when I was younger, I felt like I had a calling of some kind. I thought maybe I was going to be a religious brother because there were some of the brothers in some of the Catholic schools. I went in and out of public school, Catholic school. There was a brother that I liked, and I thought, well, maybe I might be a brother. I don't know anything about a brother, but no one ever asked me, so I just went on with my life. And then I wound up going to Notre Dame and graduating there, and I felt that maybe I might be called to be a priest, but nobody ever asked me, so I didn't pursue it. I didn't know how to become a priest. And then later on, after I was married, I met someone who was a deacon, and I said, well, what's a deacon? And he told me some things that he did, and so I thought, well, maybe I might want to be a deacon. And it turns out our diocese in South Bend did not have a deacon formation program. So I thought, well, I guess I won't be a deacon. And I said, God, whatever a deacon is, if you want me to do that, you have to create a program here because I'm not planning on moving. And then 5 years later, I had a new pastor, and he came up to me and he said, oh, the diocese has created a deacon formation program, and I put your name in to be a candidate. And I said, well, God, since you created a program for me, I guess I got to check it out. And so that's how I wound up becoming a deacon. 5 years later, after instruction and training, I became a deacon. And when I became a deacon, I also got involved with the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus and the National Association of Black Catholic Deacons. And then I after a few years of involvement, then I became president of the Clergy Caucus. So I won't go into that whole story, but I just wanted to let you know that somewhere, somehow, God is calling each of you, and as well as He called me, as God called me, to a vocation. And if you haven't spent any time thinking about it, maybe you'll spend some time thinking and praying about it, because if you think about it, if you take a hammer, well, let's say like a hammer. Let's say you take a cell phone, and the cell phone is called to be a cell phone, and it has a special purpose, things you can do with it. But if I use it as a hammer, then I'm not doing the sort of things that I should be doing, right? So I'm not living out the vocation that I was created to. And sometimes people have a vocation and they're not living that vocation as it should be. Maybe they think they were called to be married, but they have a lot of difficulty in relationships, and maybe they're not called to be married. Maybe they're called to be single, or maybe they're called to do some other things. So anyway, so this is the sense of, we all have a vocation because we're all called to be holy, but we have to discern and pray and ask God to reveal, what am I being called to do? Now, some people are being called to be a priest. And so, but before I go on with that, a little bit more about deacons. So this is, I'm gonna share a little story about St. Philip, who was a deacon in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8. And he was talking to someone, an Ethiopian, who was Ethiopian. In the Bible, it often says Ethiopian eunuch, but he was a very well-respected person. He was the treasurer for this queen, and so he was in charge of all the money. And he was reading something in a passage, and then all of a sudden, Philip appeared to him, and he interpreted for him what it meant. And so all of a sudden he says, can I be baptized? Can I become a Christian? And so he said, yeah. So he baptized him. And so we have the first, perhaps, non-Jewish convert in history recorded in the Bible, and it's an Ethiopian. Sometimes we don't know our history well enough to know that there are people, excuse me one second, to know that there are people throughout biblical history who are of African descent, but this is one of them. And the thing that I wanted to point out in that story is, number one, that's one of the things deacons can do, is they can baptize. And I've done a few baptisms. But the other thing is that the reason that there are deacons is because earlier in Acts, there was this tension in the church. It was the early church, and everyone always thinks that the early church, everything was great. There was no problems, but there was a problem. And the problem was that there were some Jews who were the Hellenistic Jews. They were Greek-speaking Jews. And then there were Hebraic Jews, which were the Hebrews. And so those who were, the followers of Jesus, and they became the apostles, and they were going around spreading the gospel, well, there was something where they were neglecting the needs of those who were these Greek-speaking Jews. And so they complained and said, well, we're not getting our needs met. And so the early apostles, we call them bishops now, came together and they talked about it and they prayed about it. And they said, well, we can't stop what we're doing to do those sort of things, to wait on tables, basically. So why don't you call 7 righteous men from amongst yourselves? And then they did that, and they laid hands on them. In a sense, they ordained them to go and serve the needs of those folks, to other folks who are being neglected. And that's where we have deacons, servants. Comes from diakonos, which means serve, to serve, or servant. And the thing about it is that I'm always mindful that these were 2 different communities that were in tension with one another, even though they were in the church and they were all followers of Christ. But God's solution was to take people from amongst that community, the Greek-speaking community, ordain them, and let them go out and serve those people, their people. And this is how the church has grown in many ways throughout the world. That what would happen is that there would be missionaries who would go forth and proclaim the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then they would plant the seed in that community, and then eventually, once people matured spiritually, that they would then take on the ministry of their own people, be it as whether it was those who were called to religious life, those who were called to clergy, or whatever it might be, or those who were or lay folks who were called to serve. And but it happened with almost every population in the world except in America. It did not happen with African Americans. There was difficulty having that happen in the United States. And I think you probably can guess why that is, but we have had the problem of racism. We have had the problem going all the way back to slavery days, and all the things that we have seen, and we revisited all the hurts of the last 400 some odd years, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and then now that we still have some of those things with us today, obviously. And so so what happens is that let me go back. What happens is that because of racism, the church is not doing what it has done elsewhere, which is plant the seed locally. And when people come mature, and even in Africa, you see this happening. You see that Africa is one of the places in the world where the church is just growing like crazy, the Catholic Church. And so much so that we have people coming from Africa because of the shortage of priests that we have here, and even sisters, and they're coming here and they're serving. So, so the question would be, why is that, and what can we do about it? I have another example, another slide that I'm showing. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it starts with the quote from Luke where Jesus, after he was in the desert, and he came and he did a reading and he began his ministry. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, and to declare a year of favor to the Lord." And so in a sense, it's going forth and proclaiming the good news. The Spirit called Jesus to do that, and those who are followers of Jesus to do that. And Jesus went out and did this regardless of someone's background, or regardless of what their social circumstances may be. So, so we have the example of the woman at the well who was a Samaritan. She was a woman. He met her, and she was alone, and he was alone, which was against the social mores. But Jesus engaged her in conversation, and then eventually she realized that he was the Messiah. And then, whereas before she was ashamed of her life, she wound up being someone who went and started calling everybody to come see someone who told me everything about me, about my life, and has accepted me. And so they came to believe in Christ because of the woman who, again, she was not viewed well in society as a woman, and she also was a Samaritan. So Jews and Samaritans didn't get along, and Jesus had no reason to talk to her except for the love in his heart to spread the good news. The Spirit has anointed him to do that. But that is what we are called to do, and that's what the church is called to do. So the question that I have, and actually this is something that I posed this question to the Apostolic Nuncio, who is the Pope's representative to the church here in the United States. This was a gathering of the National Black Catholic Congress Board, with which I sit on that board as a member of the Clergy Caucus. And I was asked to talk about indigenous clergy and priests in particular. And so the question that I came up with was, does God still call Black folk? Because when we look at how the church was not planted in our community as it had been in some others, and then so some people will look at it and say, well, okay, well, we're closing schools in African American neighborhoods, we're closing parishes, we're collapsing parishes, even as we're growing in some other areas. So the question would be, why should we have vocations? Well, if God is calling Black folks, and if Jesus is calling Samaritans, and he's going and calling lepers, and calling the poor, and calling those, and then we have the deacons going out and baptizing Ethiopians and baptizing other folks from Greek-speaking folks. Obviously, if God is calling such folks as them, why would God not call African Americans? And so I believe that God is calling us. And if God is calling African Americans to the church, which Jesus created and instituted and told us to go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing, then I would think that God would give us the gifts that we need to build up the church in our own community. And so so when we see the folks, the young folks in our community, we have to ask ourselves, okay, how can I bring the gospel to them? Is God calling them? God is always calling them. So how can I use the gifts that God has given me to help them to know God? So that is the question: is does God still call Black folks? And if God does call Black folks, then God has to make a way. You'll notice if you see the screen, there's a little heart in the left-hand corner, just as a reminder that St. Augustine also said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. So our hearts are restless until they rest in the Lord. And if our hearts are restless until they rest in the Lord, then God is calling us. And if God is calling us, then we need to have a church that is responsive to the needs of our folk. The other question that I posed to the Apostolic Nuncio, and I posed to other folks, is that what color is Jesus? What color is Jesus? Now, before I get to that question, let me go back to, is God still calling us? A lot of times I run into people who are surprised that there are Black Catholics. I know in Chicago there are a lot more Black Catholics. There are multiple parishes. There are folks that are there. But in South Bend and a lot of other places in the country, count yourselves blessed because you don't have that. And people will assume that African Americans are anything but Catholic. But the other thing that happens is that in terms of, is God still calling us? There are a lot of studies that show that when people do become priests, they ask them, like, when did you discern a call? And they often say, well, when I was about 12, maybe 15 years old, I started thinking that maybe I had a call to the priesthood. I had a call to something, just as I did. Now, in our society, when we get to that age group, you think about African American males, the age of 12 to 15. And so the images that I'm putting forth right now are images that we've been seeing a lot lately. We see Trayvon Martin, who I believe he may have been maybe 17 years old, maybe 15 years old when he was killed. Tamir Rice, he was 12 years old. We see people who are perceiving African American males as a threat, particularly as we start to get older. And so instead of the church being one to go out and call and say, what is your vocation? How can we help you to find your vocation, discern your vocation, and live out your life as God has called you? Is this threat that is perceived. And so then we see people being harassed, and we see the gatekeepers in society saying, well, do you belong here? Can I help you? And that even happens in the church, unfortunately, because of systemic racism. It is not that maybe people wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to be racist, but the system is set up for the benefit of some, detriment of others, solely because of race. And even when people don't realize that they are part of that system, the system winds up working perfectly, to the point that at the end of the day, certain people have certain advantages and certain opportunities, including becoming ordained priests and ordained deacons, as well as becoming consecrated religious, etc. And then some people are not, because of race. And we have to realize that the church is not immune to systemic racism or white supremacy. We have to realize that the church, God has entrusted, Jesus has entrusted the church to sinners. So we have our sins, we have our flaws, we have we're tainted in some way by our sins. And then for some folks, it's because of race. Some people, it's because of language. Sometimes it's because of sex or gender. And so we have to realize that that is the case, but yet God is still calling Black folk. If God is still calling Black folk, God has a reason for it, and God has a means by which it can flourish and be fruitful. And there have been times throughout church history, throughout our nation's history, where we have been very productive and fruitful. In Chicago in particular, there were a lot of folks who came up from the South, and they were either escaping the more overt racism of the South, or they were looking for opportunities employment-wise, and they landed in places like Chicago in the Midwest. And meanwhile, people were leaving because of racism, and then because of different reasons, they wanted to go out to the suburbs or somewhere else. And so as Black folks moved in, they moved out, and the communities became Black. This is where I give you a clear example, if you're not aware of it, of the term ghetto. Where does the term ghetto come from? It comes from Jews. Jewish ghettos were a staple of our community. Where Jews settled, those were called ghettos. But then when the Black folks moved in, a lot of the Jews moved out. And then the name ghetto became associated with the African Americans who came in from the South. And so that's where that term comes from, even though we don't always recognize it that way. But I guess my point is that we have to realize that there is racism, but God is still calling us. And so that brings up the next question. What color is Jesus? The reason that I ask this of the Apostolic Nuncio, and I ask this of several folks, I've preached on this in my parish, is that if we understand that a priest, and so we're talking about indigenous clergy, so we're talking about, and we welcome folks from other countries, we welcome all those from Africa who are sharing their gifts, we welcome those from other parts of the world, and we welcome those of European descent and ancestry who have served in many ways in this church. It was those from of European heritage who called Father Tolton to the priesthood, an Irish immigrant, and also a German priest. And they saw his gifts and they said, have you ever thought about being a priest? And that's how he became a priest. So we appreciate those gifts. The thing is that when we recognize that for someone to be a priest, they are standing in persona Christi, which means in the person of Christ. So they represent Christ, which means they represent power. They represent the power to bind and to loose. They represent the power to forgive sins. They represent the power to baptize, or in the case of a bishop, to ordain. They represent power. And if in our society we have white supremacy, which is part of the reason for systemic racism, what is going to be perceived a threat? Well, a Black priest is perceived as a threat, because that is a person who may have power or to bind and loose and to do all these other things. And so quite naturally, it would be difficult for those who have those views to ordain someone or to even encourage someone to become clergy, to have this sense of power. And we have to imagine power in a way God imagines it. It's a humility associated with it. It's not pride. It's not like we see with some folks that power means, domination and doing this and that. That's not how God asks us to use power. we use power to help those who need help, or we help those who need justice, for example, to speak up, truth to power, and things like that, to help those who are poor, to bring liberty to captives. Those are things that we are asked to do. But when you think about what a Black priest is, and I've got on my slide, I've got the image of George Floyd, may he rest in peace, in the corner. That is the image that some people see. So at an early age, 12 to 15, when some people are being called to the priesthood or being called to some sort of vocation, but society is now recognizing that they are looking more as a man, looking more as a threat. We have to be able to purge ourselves, to purge our church of that sort of thinking, our institutions of that sort of thinking. And so that is why I ask, what color is Jesus? Because every priest stands in the person of Jesus. And if we see that person on the altar, we are seeing Christ. Okay. And if you're looking at the image, you see a lot of the priests and also some deacons from the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. I hope everybody's still with me. I hope I'm not talking too much or too fast. But in a sense, what we need to be able to do is to say that every church can be considered successfully planted if it produces fruit. So if the church has been in Chicago, for example, for years, and we know Father Tolton was there, and that is where a lot of the early church excitement of the church in Chicago Black Catholics community came from. Why are there not more Black Catholics becoming priests like Father Tolton? And so we want to be able to say that the church is planted not only in the community of our European brothers and sisters and the descendants of them, but also in our African American community and in our Latino community and in our Asian American community and other communities where you don't see the number of clergy and also religious sisters and nuns as maybe we might expect. Particularly because we are a faithful people. We're very forgiving. We have that sense of spirituality that got us through a lot of things in this nation. That's part of our Afrocentric, our African American spirituality. But I believe that we are not truly free. Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring liberty to the captives, to those who are poor, to bring the good news to the poor." We are not truly free if we are Eucharistic people just in the pews, but that somehow or another we have produced representatives on the altar itself to offer gifts and sacrifices on behalf of our community, and to pray for other communities. When we have somebody in that sense, then we can say we are producing the fruit that a community should produce if it is planted. But when we don't have that fruit, then we have to ask ourselves why. Why is our tree not producing the fruit that it should? And so that is where I feel we need to go, is that so that, as it says in Malachi, so that from the rising of the sun to its setting, and in every place, even in places where some people are afraid to go, but we know them like the back of our hand, perhaps because that's where we grew up. In every place, incense is offered to God's name, and a pure offering is offered. And then you may recognize this image for those who don't see it, but this is Archbishop Wilton Gregory, who may become the first cardinal, fingers crossed. And he is a native of Chicago, so I've got him up there. And of course, there's Bishop Perry and there's other folks that we recognize as in our midst. And of course, your own priest that you have, Father David and Father Gerard. But having that person on the altar, and not only just on the altar, but going into those somewhat closed circles. We hear about clericalism, where there's this sense where the priests are talking to priests. Well, if we have some folks who are in on those conversations to say, here are some of our needs that are not being met. Remember the deacons at the beginning of church history. Our needs are not being met. Okay, well, so bring some people, righteous men from your community, that we may lay hands on them, that they may serve. This is what we're talking about. And so, and of course, here's Father Tolton. I've got an image of him, which I think if you're at St. Benedict's, you probably are aware, with Father Gerard there, you probably are aware of Father Tolton. If not, he's going to be very, very sad. But obviously the first recognizably African-American priest in the country, and he is now venerable. And we hope that he may become, he along with several others, become the first African-American saints. And so how do we then build up indigenous African-American priests? Okay, as much as we welcome other priests, any priest, but how do we build them up so we produce fruit? Well, I think part of it is acknowledging and speaking up about the systemic racism in our seminaries, in our churches, and our parishes, understanding that priests don't come out of thin air, and none of these vocations come out of thin air. All these vocations come out of the community, out of the parish or out of the community who surround the parish and who live in that area. So there's schools. What are the schools teaching? What are the illustrations? What are the images on the walls of the school? Here's a school that I'm showing. This is a school in South Bend. It is Holy Cross Elementary School, and I've been there several times, and they've asked me to come and preach sometimes. They don't have an African-American clergy there. Actually, I'm the only African-American clergy ordained for our diocese. so if they want somebody to preach, it's usually me. But they've embraced Father Tolton, and they purchased, one of the parents purchased an image, an icon of Father Tolton. And so they had a special mass, and they had it up there, and I told the story of him and how each of them might be called to be like Tolton. It's talking about the stories of our, and letting people know that they have a vocation. God is calling us, whatever that vocation may be, but sharing those stories, putting those images where people can see them. So there's the schools, there's the parishes, and of course, it's bringing in people who look like us to talk to us. So maybe it's inviting people to St. Benedict's who, maybe they wouldn't normally see, and other communities. And then it is developing, in my mind, a culture of vocations where, when you think about the culture, in our African-American culture, there are certain things that people grew up thinking, this is something that we do. And so I think that we tend to be spiritually oriented. I think we have a lot of folks who believe in God. We also have a lot of folks who believe in a sense of community. We have a very strong sense of community. We tend to be forgiving. We try to be joyful even in the midst of suffering. Those are parts of our culture. Sometimes we have these stereotypes that we're always good at basketball, or we're always good at sports, or that sometimes there are the stereotypes that, we are people to be feared. But we have to think about the culture that we are creating. And so it's a sense that everyone is called by God to be holy. Every child that we see is called by God. So how do we use the gifts that God has given us to change the culture to be a culture of vocations where everybody's talking about it? There are stories about what does it mean to be called to be a single person, to be married, to be the sacrament of marriage, by the way. What does it mean to be a religious sister, a religious nun? What is the difference between a sister and a nun? What is a brother, a religious brother? And we have people come in and talk about that. And then we have deacons, we have priests, we have bishops, we have others. But how do we also live out our vocations as a layperson in my place of employment? What am I called to do and to be in that setting? Because the church is meant to transform culture. So we have to develop a culture of vocations where we're always talking about this. It's not that, okay, when you grow up, I hope that you become a lawyer or a doctor, or I hope that you become an educator. It's like, well, I hope that you become a priest. I hope you think about that. I hope you think about becoming a deacon. I hope you think about becoming a sister or brother. We have to have that sort of a culture to be able to create vocations. Otherwise, it's more of an accident than it is, us producing fruit within our community. If you are discerning a call, whether it is to marriage, or it is to clerical life or religious life, consecrated life, or single life, what should you do? And so I would say the first thing that we all must do is to pray. The first act is always prayer. I need to think about and pray and discern and ask God, what did you create me to be? What are you calling me to do? What, in other words, would make me happiest? I can be somewhat happy doing this. I can be okay doing this. But what is that passion that you created me for, that I can serve you in this very unique way and use my gifts and really be happy? And maybe it's married life. Maybe it's being a parent, raising children. Maybe it's being a sister. Maybe it's some of these other things. So the first thing is we pray. The second thing is talk to someone about it. No one asked me, and therefore I never pursued it. If someone would have maybe asked me, I might have said, I might be thinking about vocation to being a religious brother or being a priest. It wasn't until I ran into a deacon that I even, pursued it. But maybe we need to then talk to somebody, find out who's doing that, and visit with them, or bring in people, have certain days where this is a vocation awareness week in our parish or in our school, or this is vocation Sunday. And there is actually a National Vocations Awareness Week in November. That might be a good target. It's actually during Black Catholic History Month, so that makes it doubly a good time to do that. But then it's like, okay, if I think I might be called to this particular vocation or that, I'm called to be holy, let me start living my life in a way like that to see if this is what I'm called. Let me maybe get involved in some service activities, maybe start working with some folks that maybe take me out of my comfort zone. I have to rely on God and the Holy Spirit to be able to even do that. And then I'll see if that's what I'm called to be. It's like, okay, I'm going to do student teaching if I want to maybe go on to be a teacher, or I want to, be an intern to see if I want to go into medicine. Okay, well, maybe start living that life of holiness. And maybe, okay, I feel called to be holy. We're all called to be holy, but not in this way. But I still feel, so let me continue to search until I find it. So praying, talking to people about it, maybe trying to live that life in some way of holiness, and then, acting upon it, maybe actively pursuing a seminary or a convent, or talking to someone about marriage, or talking to somebody about being a youth minister or a music minister, or some other things that folks can do. And keep in mind that 98% of the church is lay people. And so if everyone is called to a ministry, to vocation, but we only talk about vocations to priesthood, we're leaving out 98% of the church. Everyone is called to a vocation, and the lay folks are going to have the biggest stake in what our church becomes or doesn't become. So I think I've said these things. And there are resources available for those who think they might be called to religious or clerical life. We have the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, and we have the National Association of Black Catholic Seminarians, the National Association of Black Catholic Deacons, the National Black Sisters Conference. And then there are some other organizations out there, National Black Catholic Administrators, with the Offices of Black Catholics, etc. There are a lot of different things out there, and we need to know what they are and avail ourselves of them.